some of you may know from my past lecturing and teaching, and as Michael alluded to in his opening remarks, one of my interests has been in studying the Abrahamic scriptures as literature. And one of the topics that keeps coming up in that work is thinking about the works, the scriptures of the Abrahamic religions, the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and the Quran, as a kind of literary trilogy. In fact, I've done a course, I'm currently teaching a course which I kind of somewhat tongue-in-cheek call the Holy Tribal, because we read readings from each of the three scriptures, the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and the Quran. And the idea behind that is that these works come out of a common literary tradition, this is the argument, and therefore there's a kind of a first work, a second work, a third work in this common literary tradition, and that it's not possible really to understand the later works in that tradition without understanding the earlier works. So, for example, to the extent that the New Testament builds on the Hebrew Bible, one cannot really fully appreciate the texts within the New Testament unless one has some kind of appreciation of the Hebrew Bible to which they're building on. Same thing with the Quran, to the extent that the Quran is building on the New Testament and the Hebrew Bible. Again, I think one can't have a full appreciation of the Quran without seeing its connections and interconnections with the New Testament and the Hebrew Bible. And one of the ways I try to make this point when I'm talking about those scriptures is by comparing them to what I consider to be kind of a trilogy of epics from the Greco-Roman world, the classical world. In particular, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid. And in those lectures, you know, I have usually my prop is this nice set. It comes in a box. The box is over there, of the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid, and these are all three translations by Robert Fagles, and they're published by a single publisher, and they're put into a common binding and print and everything. But it kind of makes the nice point, accidentally in a way, that it's possible to think of these three works, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid, as a kind of epic trilogy, that they come out of a common literary tradition, and that it's really not possible to understand the later works in this trilogy without fully understanding the earlier works. So as I say, in these lectures or classes where I talk about the Abrahamic scriptures, I use these as kind of my example. For today's talk, I want to kind of reverse the procedure and talk about the Aeneid as the concluding third in this trilogy, kind of like the way I've talked about the Quran as the concluding third in the trilogy of the Abrahamic scriptures. And as I said, the idea here is that if we're just taking these things from a literary point of view, a secular or historical academic point of view, works that build on earlier works naturally depend on them in a variety of ways. And depending on the degree of what's sometimes called intertextuality, the degree to which a later text depends upon or implies or refers to an earlier text, it becomes important to have an awareness of those earlier texts in order to appreciate the later one. Now, obviously, this doesn't stop people from reading books in any order that they want. I mean, many people obviously, for example, read the Quran without having read the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament, or many people read the New Testament without having read the Hebrew Bible. And likewise, many people read the Aeneid without ever having considered the Iliad and the Odyssey. And to some degree, you know, that's fine, and one can do it. But the argument that I'd like to make today and explore with you a little bit is that although that can technically be done, one can't really have a full appreciation of the later work until one really appreciates the interconnections between the later one and the earlier one. And this is particularly true in the case of Virgil's Aeneid, because Virgil's Aeneid is a very self-conscious addition, building on the Homeric epics of the Iliad and the Odyssey and putting it into the context of Rome and its founding and its destiny and kind of the Roman national character. So this notion of intertextuality or of a common literary tradition that requires one to know about the earlier works in order to appreciate the later ones, for some people can sometimes be seen as derivativeness, that somehow the later works are not as fully original or authentic or somehow artificial compared to the earlier ones. And in the case of the Aeneid, I think that's often been an impression that somehow Virgil's craft is not as good as Homer's craft, or that his story in some ways are not as good as Homer's story, and perhaps that's true. But one particular expression of this idea of what Virgil did comes out of a very nice poem from 1959 by Auden, and it's called Secondary Epic. And it relates to this idea that what Virgil did was somehow secondary, derivative, and really, frankly, not very good. I won't read the whole thing, but I'd like to read the beginning and the end of it. Auden's poem goes like this. No, Virgil, no. Not even the first of the Romans can learn his Roman history in the future tense. Not even to serve your political turn. Hindsight as foresight makes no sense. How was your shield-making God to explain why his masterpiece, his grand panorama of scenes from the coming historical drama of an unborn nation, war after war, all the birthdays needed to preordain the Octavius the world was waiting for, should so abruptly, mysteriously stop? What cause could he show why he didn't foresee the future beyond 31 BC? And then Auden goes on to kind of imagine, well, since you're making it all up out of whole cloth, Virgil, I could make it up out of whole cloth too, and he inserts a kind of hypothetical scene that could be in the Aeneid. And then the poem ends kind of in the same vein. No, Virgil, no. Behind your verse so masterfully made, we hear the weeping of a muse betrayed. Your Anchises, that's Aeneas' father, isn't convincing at all. It's asking too much of us to be told, a shade so long-sighted, a father who knows, that Romulus will build a wall, Augustus found an age of gold, and is trying to teach a dutiful son the love of what will be in the long run, would mention them both, but not disclose. Surely no prophet could afford to miss, no man of destiny fail to enjoy so clear a proof of providence as this. The names predestined for the Catholic boy, whom Arian Odovaker will depose. And this end of the poem is kind of like, and I'm going to go into this a little bit, that one of the things that happens in the Aeneid is that Aeneas is given a prophecy of the future of the greatness of Rome, and it stops at 31 BC, more or less. And this is the age of Augustus, who is the first emperor. But the prophecy of the future history of Rome does not go to the downfall of Rome, which occurs in the 5th century of the current era. So somebody approaching the Aeneid from Auden's perspective or a similar perspective will often look at the Aeneid and see it as a kind of secondary epic or a derivative work. And that's certainly one way to look at it, but I don't think it's necessarily the most accurate or the most helpful. And so what I'd like to try to do here is take some of these observations that Auden has and kind of turn them on their head, looking at what it seems that Virgil was trying to achieve in his epic. And although Auden's poem focuses on the prophecy of the future greatness of Rome, which is certainly one of the key motifs throughout the Aeneid, if we look at it from Virgil's time, from the author's perspective, or the time when the work was composed, one of the key objectives of the composition of the Aeneid seems to be to provide, I'm not making this up, it's a common interpretation, convincing, impressive foundation myth or pedigree for Rome and the Roman Empire. So all of the things that kind of Auden is calling out as secondary and derivative are actually a large part of the point. And the idea is that Rome, which has now, I guess by Virgil's day, had kind of become the sole superpower of its era, is to demonstrate that it's not, as a culture, is not a Johnny-come-lately. It's not a parvenu. I think in the modern world, a lot of times, especially the last century or so, we place a lot of emphasis and we value things which are new because they're new, and we tend to depreciate sometimes things that are old because they're kind of musty and dusty. But in the ancient world, it was really the opposite, that a culture that did not have a long, ancient, and illustrious pedigree was not considered as great as a culture that did. And it turns out that it may be that Rome didn't have a great natural pedigree. And over the years that Rome was ascendant as a political and cultural entity, a different pedigree, a better pedigree, emerged. And this is the raw material that Virgil was working with when he composed the Aeneid. The idea of the Aeneid, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is that it's an epic that tells the story of a fellow named Aeneas, who is one of the Trojans fighting at the Trojan War, and he's mentioned in Homer's Iliad. And that the idea is that Aeneas escapes from the destruction of Troy and manages to make his way by ship across the Mediterranean, along the way having many exciting and fabulous adventures, but ultimately landing in Italy and successfully, establishes a new home there, which will become the future of Rome. And this idea of Aeneas being a progenitor of the Roman people is something that had been emerging probably for 200 or 300 years prior to Virgil's writing this. But Virgil's the one who kind of took these various strands of the Aeneas story and put them together in what has become, since then, the comprehensive, the definitive telling of the story, as it were. And he's put it together in a very particular way. I mean, there's lots of ways you could tell the Aeneas story, but the way Virgil did it was to create an epic poem, a poem that in Latin, looks like, as close as you can get, the kind of epic poems that Homer created with the Iliad and the Odyssey. And not only is the content then, using Aeneas and these other characters coming from the Homeric poems, we have the content, we also have the form of Virgil's work. He's making an epic. And the work itself is filled with these allusions and references and echoes of the Iliad and the Odyssey, so that this book, I mean, as I mentioned at the beginning, this idea of intertextuality for later books building on earlier works is true whenever you have a later work like this. But in Virgil's case, in the Aeneid is rife with these intertextual connections to the earlier epics. And so, in much the same way, actually, as the Quran is with the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, which is kind of how I personally ended up here, thinking about these different things. And so really, in order to fully appreciate what Virgil has crafted in the Aeneid, all three of these elements, I think, need to be taken into account. That the message of the work called the Aeneid is to be found in the combination of its content, its form, and its intertextual relations to the earlier epics. And that the combination of these things creates a work which integrates Rome into this classical history that had begun with the Greek poets, with Homer and so on, and gives Rome a pedigree that it otherwise wouldn't have, and leads us, and I'll talk a little bit about this at the end, leads us to this notion of thinking that there's something that we might usefully think of as kind of the Greco-Roman world, that there's some kind of homogeneous, continuous entity that began with Greece and sort of culminated or ended with Rome. And this is actually more of a kind of backstory, of a creation, as it were, from people like Virgil trying to integrate Rome into the earlier great civilization. So to start this the next step in the presentation, it's useful to look at where the character of Aeneas first comes from in the Iliad. And in the Iliad, Aeneas is a relatively minor character. He's a great warrior nonetheless, and in some ways he's close in prowess to the great Achilles, who is presumably the greatest warrior of all. And in the Iliad, Book 20, Homer, who didn't know anything about Rome was coming, or that Virgil was going to be writing about this. This is just all 700 years earlier. Okay, Homer writes, Achilles next. He hurled his spear, and its long shadow flew, and the weapon struck the balanced round shield of Aeneas under the outer rim where the bronze ran thinnest, backed by the thinnest bull's hide. Straight through the Pelian ash burst. The shield rang out with a screech. But Aeneas crouched low, holding the buckler off his chest, terrified as the shaft shot past his back, hurled so hard it plunged deep in the ground, even after it tore up 2 round plies of the shield that cased his body. Dodging the big spear, Aeneas got to his feet, a dizzying swirl of anguish rushing down his eyes, blind with fear. The point had struck so close. But drawing his sharp sword, Achilles charged, wild, hurtling toward him, loosing a savage cry as Aeneas hefted a boulder in his hands, a tremendous feat. No 2 men could hoist it, weak as men are now. But all on his own he raised it high with ease. Then and there he'd have struck Achilles lunging in. The rock would have hit him square in the casque or shield. The gear would have warded off grim death, and Achilles, closing, would have slashed his life away with a well-honed blade, if the god of earthquakes had not marked it quickly and called the gods at once who grouped around him. Now I tell you, my heart aches for great Aeneas. He'll go down to the house of death this instant, overwhelmed by Achilles, all because he trusted the distant deadly archer's urgings. Poor fool, as if Apollo would lift a hand to save him now from death, grim death. Aeneas the innocent. Why should Aeneas suffer here for no good reason, embroiled in the quarrels of others, not his own? He always gave us gifts to warm our hearts, gifts for the gods who rule the vaulting skies. So come, let us rescue him from death ourselves, for fear the son of Cronus might just tower in rage if Achilles kills this man. He is destined to survive. Yes, so the generation of Dardanus will not perish, obliterated without an heir, without a trace. Dardanus, dearest to Zeus of all the sons that mortal women brought to birth for father. Now he has come to hate the generation of Priam, and now Aeneas will rule the men of Troy in power, his sons' sons, and the sons born in future years. So that's in Homer's Iliad. And the idea here is that Aeneas is saved from death by the gods because he has a destiny ahead of him to rule Trojans and to continue the Trojan line in a certain sense. But the Iliad never says where this is going to happen or when this is going to happen. And so it kind of just lived out there like a hook, begging later composers and historians, if you will, to kind of try to complete the story of what happened with Aeneas. And as I mentioned a little earlier, it became quite common in Italy at some point to begin thinking about Aeneas as having traveled from Troy to Italy and to have fulfilled his destiny in Italy rather than somewhere on the eastern Mediterranean. So these versions were out there when Virgil came along to compose the Aeneid, probably in the 10 years between the year 29 and 19 BC or BCE. And this was just at the time that Octavian had become the emperor, first emperor of Rome, known as Augustus. And so there were a lot of motivations that seem to have shaped the composition of the Aeneid, giving a founding myth to Rome, giving the place a pedigree, also celebrating the lineage that had produced Augustus and the magnificence of his reign, which was still in progress at the time Virgil was composing this. And it turns out that at the time this was all coming around, there was an associate of Augustus's, Maecenas, who was a kind of unofficial minister for culture in Rome, and who had taken it partly upon himself to be a patron of the arts. And in fact, his name now has become a byword for a great patron of the arts, a Maecenas. And he commissioned works of art by poets that would contribute to the kind of ideological upbuilding of Rome. One of the examples of the works that he commissioned was from a contemporary of Virgil's, the poet Horace. And for example, in one of Horace's works is called the Epistles, and in the second book of Epistles, the first epistle itself is dedicated to Augustus, who is the first emperor of Rome, and it begins in this translation, since you, great Caesar, singly wield the charge of Rome's concerns so manifold and large, with sword and shield the commonwealth protect, with morals grace it, and with laws correct. The bard, methinks, would do a public wrong, who having gained your ear should keep it long. All right, and then the epistle goes on, but this idea that celebrating, aggrandizing Augustus and his reign seems to be part of the poetic mission of the day. In that same epistle, Horace has a couple of other lines which have become quite well known for a different, in a different context, where he talks about the relationship between Roman art and Greek art. And, you know, for all of the egotism, one might say, for the Romans and the Roman Empire, one place where they seem to have clearly understood their limitations or believed they had limitations was when it came to culture. And one of Horace's great epithets, or the line in this epistle, is he says, "Conquered Greece, her conqueror subdued, and Rome grew polished, who till then was rude." And it's this idea of the one who's conquered actually conquering the conqueror. Of course, not in a military sense, but this is like in an intellectual and cultural sense. So that all the things that had been cultivated in Greece, in Athens, whether it's philosophy, theater, poetry, and so on, actually took hold in Rome and became the mode, the method, the aspiration of Roman culture. And this is something I think we see in Virgil quite clearly and intentionally. That yes, it's not even a deficit from the Roman part, from Virgil's point of view. The idea is we are part of this tradition and going to continue it by producing works like the Aeneid. So over the 10 years that Virgil worked on the Aeneid, supposedly his procedure was that he actually first wrote the work out in prose, so that he kind of had an outline of it, and then spent the remainder of the time turning the prose outline into verse. And when Virgil died, he himself considered the work to be unfinished. Lots of people who have read it, sometimes people do find parts where it looks unfinished, but it's not horribly unfinished. I mean, it's the kind of thing he probably could have worked on it for another 100 years, and he still would have thought it was unfinished. He often said that his process of creating verse was like a bear who licks its cub into shape. Because apparently in the ancient world they thought that baby bears were born without any form, just a lump, and then the mother bear would lick it and gradually sculpt it into bearhood. And that was Virgil's metaphor for his process, that he would lick his verses into shape. And he spent 10 years doing it and then died. And because he thought it was unfinished, actually had ordered that the manuscript be burned. Fortunately, of course, it was not on royal orders. And so the work has passed down to today. And it's been considered, and from a Western European point of view, one of the magnificent poetic achievements of Western civilization. And I suppose up until, 100 years ago or something, when everybody had a Latin education, reading and translating and memorizing the Aeneid was a common part of many people's upbringing. So let me turn now and talk just a little bit about the structure and the contents of the Aeneid. As you may know, if you're familiar with the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Iliad and the Odyssey are each today exist in 24 books. The Aeneid exists in 12 books, and it tells, as I mentioned before, it's the kind of the story that it tells runs from the destruction of Troy at the end of the Trojan War, which that story itself is actually not told in the Iliad. There's a little bit of a retelling of it in the Odyssey, but it's not told in the Iliad per se. The Aeneid begins with the destruction of Troy and follows the wanderings of Aeneas through the Mediterranean, lots of places that he visits. In particular, he ends up in Carthage, which is in North Africa, today near modern Tunis. And Carthage was the great rival of Rome. In fact, there was about 100 years of war called the Punic Wars between the Carthaginians. You may have heard of Hannibal and his elephants, right, coming through the Alps. Those were the Carthaginians. And ultimately, the Romans were able to destroy Carthage. But it was the great enemy, as it were. And it turns out that as part of Aeneas's travels through the Mediterranean, one of his first stop-off points is in Carthage, which itself in the story is in the process of being founded by Queen Dido. And so the story of Aeneas and Dido is one of the great, lots of different aspects to the story. It has, partly it's a love story, partly it's a story of two kingdoms. It's been done in opera, all paintings, all kinds of things. And Virgil makes that kind of like the centerpiece of the first half of the Aeneid. In fact, books 2 and 3 of the Aeneid take place with Aeneas in Dido's court as a kind of flashback, recounting his travels through the Mediterranean, which, if you're familiar with the Odyssey, for example, the same thing happens with Odysseus when he comes with the Phaeacians, and after he's been given dinner and properly entertained, Odysseus then tells the story of his travels and how he's gotten to the Phaeacians. So this is, again, one of many, many, many kind of parallels that Virgil has built into this. So the net effect of all this is, one is meant to experience, I think, is that what Aeneas is ultimately doing, in some sense, is founding new Troy. That Rome is the continuation of Troy by other means or in other geography. And that this has lots of implications, both for Rome and for the history of the world. So in the Aeneid itself, as I said, it's got 12 books. It's usually conventionally thought of in 2 halves. There's lots of ways you can kind of slice it up. The first half of the book, even though most of it is told in flashback, concerns Aeneas's wanderings through the Mediterranean, and therefore, both because of its content and the techniques, the devices that Virgil uses, the first 6 books of the Aeneid are in many ways very similar to Homer's Odyssey. Okay, and there's lots and lots of parallels. And if I'll do a couple today, but you can find many, many parallels between those two. And then the second 6 books, which books 7 to 12, take place in Italy and have to do with the founding of Aeneas's new home, as it were, and includes a battle with a fellow named Turnus, who is not happy with Aeneas moving into the neighborhood, because it turns out Aeneas is going to steal Turnus's girl, and Turnus is not keen on that. But it ends up there's a military conflict, ultimately ending in a combat between Aeneas and Turnus, which is very similar then to the Iliad and the combat that ultimately emerges between Achilles and Hector. Okay? So again, in the second half of the Aeneid, there are a lot of parallels between what Virgil has put into the Aeneid and what one finds in the Iliad. So if I can just pick a couple of examples here to kind of make these points. One, which I won't read from all of these, but all three epics begin kind of in the same way, which is a common device called the invocation of the muse, where the bard or the poet asks the muse to kind of tell the story that they're interested in hearing at this particular time. And so the beginning of the Aeneid, just like in parallel with the beginning of the Iliad and the Odyssey, begins this way. Wars and a man I sing, an exile driven on by fate. He was the first to flee the coast of Troy, destined to reach Lavinian shores and Italian soil. Yet many blows he took on land and sea from the gods above, thanks to cruel Juno's relentless rage. And many losses he bore in battle too, before he could found a city, bring his gods to Latium, source of the Latin race, the Alban lords and the high walls of Rome. Tell me, muse, how it all began. Why was Juno outraged? What would wound the queen of the gods with all her power? Why did she force a man, so famous for his devotion, to brave such rounds of hardship, bear such trials? Can such rage inflame the immortal's heart? And that's the question that Virgil is posing as the opening of the Aeneid. And the text continues, in answer to that question, there was an ancient city held by Tyrian settlers, Carthage, facing Italy and the Tiber River's mouth. But far away, a rich city trained and fierce in war. Juno loved it, they say, beyond all other lands in the world, even beloved Samos, second best. Here she kept her armor, here her chariot too, and Carthage would rule the nations of the earth if only the fates were willing. This was Juno's goal from the start, and so she nursed her city's strength. But she heard a race of men, sprung from Trojan blood, would one day topple down her Tyrian stronghold, breed an arrogant people, ruling far and wide, proud in battle, destined to plunder Libya. So the fates were spinning out the future. This was Juno's fear, and the goddess never forgot the old campaign that she had waged at Troy for her beloved Argos. No, not even now would the causes of her rage, her bitter sorrows, drop from the goddess's mind. They festered deep within her, galled her still. The judgment of Paris, the unjust slight of her beauty, the Trojan stock she loathed, the honors showered on Ganymede, ravished to the skies. Her fury inflamed by all this, the daughter of Saturn drove over endless oceans, Trojans left by the Greeks and brute Achilles. Juno kept them far from Latium, forced by the fates to wander round the seas of the world, year in, year out. Such a long, hard labor it was to found the Roman people. And that's the introduction and the beginning of the story. And so we've got this whole voyage now of Aeneas trying to fulfill his destiny of founding Rome, with Juno, the great goddess, as his adversary, looking for every way to stymie his advance, which is kind of parallel, if you remember, in the Odyssey. Odysseus' voyage home is being stymied by Poseidon, who's angry at Odysseus in that particular context. In this story, Aeneas, as I mentioned, makes it to Carthage in the process of being founded, and Dido is a beautiful young widow, and Aeneas, they fall in love with one another, and Aeneas kind of forgets his mission. And it's, again, there's a lot of parallels you may recall. In the Odyssey, for example, in the very beginning of the Odyssey, Odysseus is being held captive by Calypso, the nymph Calypso, and not allowed to be sent home. Now, both of these stories end in a similar manner, with the father of the gods, or the king of the gods, sending a message to the wayfarer, or to the situation, to break the impasse. In the case of Aeneas, Aeneas is actually a willing dallier, I should say. Okay, that Aeneas really has kind of like forgotten where he's going and why he's going, and needs to be reminded by the gods. In the case of Odysseus, at least as Homer's portraying it, is Odysseus is being held captive against his will as a sex slave. And every day Odysseus is sitting out on the headlands weeping for his home and his wife, and every night the great goddess is forcing him in to be of service. So both of these situations go on for too long, and in the case of the Aeneid, the dalliance is interrupted in this way. Jove Almighty heard that Aeneas is not moving on, and turned his gaze on the royal walls of Carthage, and the lovers, oblivious now to their good name. He summons Mercury, giving him marching orders. Quick, my son, away! Call up the zephyrs, glide on wings of the wind. Find the Dardan captain, who now malingers long in Tyrian Carthage. Look, and pays no heed to the city's fate decrees are his. Take my commands through the racing winds, and tell him, this is not the man his mother, the lovely goddess, promised. Not for this did she save him twice from Greek attacks. Never. He would be the one to master an Italy rife with leaders, shrill with the cries of war, to sire a people sprung from Teucer's noble blood, and bring the entire world beneath the rule of law. If such a glorious destiny cannot fire his spirit, if he will not shoulder the task for his own fame, does the father of Ascanius grudge his son the walls of Rome? What is he plotting now? What hope can make him loiter among his foes, lose sight of Italian offspring still to come, and all the Lavinian fields? Let him sail. This is the sum of it. This must be our message. And Mercury delivers the message, and Aeneas kind of dope slaps himself, and doesn't even have the courage to break it off with Dido in a decent way, and just actually runs out of town. And Dido's heart is broken, and she ultimately ends up committing suicide over this, but not before she's able to pronounce a curse on the descendants of Aeneas and of her own. And her final words, Dido's, the betrayed lover's final words are, the Carthaginian queen, this is my prayer, my final cry. I pour it out with my own lifeblood. And you, my Tyrians, harry with hatred all his line, his race to come. Make that offering to my ashes, send it down below. No love between our peoples, ever. No pacts of peace. Come, rising up from my bones, you avenger still unknown, to stalk those Trojan settlers, hunt with fire and iron, now or in time to come, whenever the power is yours. Shore clash with shore, sea against sea, and sword against sword. This is my curse. War between all our peoples, all their children, endless war. Okay, so now this is, of course, is what becomes what's called the Punic Wars, the actual historical wars between the Carthaginians and the Romans, which is now given a kind of itself a pedigree as being the natural result of this curse of a spurned lover of Aeneas, who has to leave in order to fulfill his mission of founding Rome. In the second half of the Aeneid, in books 7 to 12, the one that's more like the Iliad, again, we have lots of parallels that Virgil is putting into his work that both build on the content of the Iliad and make kinds of allusions to it. One of the most prominent ones, I suppose, is that Virgil gives his Aeneas a great shield. Just like in the Iliad, there's a great shield for Achilles. Now, if you've read the Iliad or are familiar with the Iliad and remember back to that, Homer actually goes into a fairly lengthy description of the design on Achilles' shield, and half of it is devoted to scenes of peace and life in the city. Half of it is devoted to scenes of war and combat. Kind of as a general conception of these two states of existence without reference to any particular place. Aeneas' shield is somewhat different. In Book 8, Virgil writes about this shield that Aeneas is being given. It's being made by Vulcan, who's the equivalent to Hephaestus, the craftsman. It says, the shield, the workmanship of the shield, no words can tell its power. There is the story of Italy, Rome in all her triumphs. There the fire god forged them, well aware of the seers and schooled in times to come. All in order, the generations born of Ascanius' stock, and all the wars they waged. And Vulcan forged them too, the mother wolf stretched out in the green grotto of Mars, twin boys at her dugs, who hung there, frisky, suckling, without a fear, as she with her lithe neck bent back, stroking each in turn, licked her wolf pups into shape with a mother's tongue. Not far from there, he had forged Rome as well, and the Sabine women brutally dragged from the crowded bowl when the circus games were played. And it goes on for a couple more pages. So, but what Virgil's done here, on the one hand, is to reproduce, do what Homer did, which is to give the hero a great shield and to have a design on it. But Virgil has turned it into this history of Rome to serve this political, one would think, this cultural political purpose of this book, which is different than what appears to be the goals of the Iliad in its case. So let me see if I can kind of bring all these things together then. Virgil's Aeneid is a master epic with a number of purposes. It is clearly about both the founding of Rome, the future of Rome, and also the kind of ideal representation of the character of the ideal Roman. And so the other part of this book is that Aeneas himself kind of represents the highest values. And one sees this actually even in the case of the episode with Dido, the Queen of Carthage. Because the great value that's celebrated in the Aeneid seems to be this one that is often, you can either call it piety or duty, but this idea that one must submerge one's own desires to larger needs, whether it's the needs of the gods, the needs of one's family, the needs of the state, the needs of destiny. And in a way that's different than the Odyssey, it's a little bit heartbreaking for Aeneas when he has to leave Dido, but he has to, because he has to do something that's more important. And so that the Aeneid is celebrating all of these things. And in order to do this, and as I said at the beginning, in order to merge the content about the founding of Rome, the form, using Homer's epic form, and the intertextuality to make it so that on every page of the Aeneid, a person who's familiar with Homer's epics will be hearing, seeing the connections, gives a kind of backstory, a pedigree to Rome that is, I think, a large part of the purpose of the Aeneid. And that's another way of looking at it instead of talking about it in terms of it being derivative or secondary or something like that. And so I'd like to conclude then by just reading from one of the famous scenes that happens in the middle of the book, in Book 6. Just like Odysseus has a journey into the underworld, roughly halfway through the Odyssey, where he meets with Agamemnon and others down there. Aeneas also has a journey into the underworld halfway through the Aeneid, but in Aeneas's case, it's actually to hear from his own father, Achilles, the future history of Rome. And again, if you didn't get it on Aeneas's shield, you'll get it in the underworld. If you don't get it in the underworld, you'll get it from Jove. I mean, you can't miss the fact that there's a great future ahead of Aeneas. And that he really has to subordinate everything to allowing that to occur. And so Anchises kind of summarizes for Aeneas what this all amounts to in kind of a famous set of lines in Book 6, where Aeneas is told by his father, he says, "Others, I have no doubt, will forge the bronze to breathe with suppler lines, draw from the block of marble features quick with life, plead their cases better, chart with their rods the stars that climb the sky, and foretell the times they rise. But you, Roman, remember, rule with all your power the peoples of the earth. These will be your arts, to put your stamp on the works and ways of peace, to spare the defeated, to break the proud in war." So, I mean, it's kind of the reverse of what Horace is saying. It's like, if the Greeks are better sculptors or better poets or that's fine. We don't have to worry about that. The Roman mission, the Roman national destiny is to rule the world. And in principle, to rule it under law, actually, and a kind of, this is actually envisioned as an enlightened kind of rulership. But this is what Rome is called to do. And this is what presumably Augustus, who is the current emperor, happy to hear, nice, also, and this is what Aeneas has been born for and is carrying out through the course of the epic, the Aeneid. So I hope that in some sense I've been able to give you a little bit of an overview of this idea of, yes, one could actually read the Aeneid without reading the Iliad and the Odyssey. But because it really does form a third in this trilogy, a lot of the texture, a lot of the meaning, a lot of the being able to actually understand the significance of the various backstories depends upon having some kind of familiarity with Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. Because ultimately, sure, one can follow the plot. I mean, you can look on a map and see where Aeneas went in his journeys, or follow the course of the battles that Aeneas is involved in. But as I kind of tried to say at the beginning, that I think that the meaning of the Aeneid, if we look at it as a work of literature, is really in the three different aspects of it. The content of the Aeneid is the message. The form of the Aeneid is also the message. And the intertextual connections between the Aeneid and the Iliad and the Odyssey is a third part of the message. And that actually being able to work with all three of those together helps one to appreciate the work in its fullest significance. And then when you get to that point, then you can decide, I think, if you think it's truly secondary or derivative, or whether you think it's a masterwork in its own right. Thank you very much for your time.